Well, thank you very much for joining our little get-together this evening. I've been looking forward to another chance to come into your living room or bedroom or ever how you take these doses and spend some time with you. The picture you just saw was of my friend Doug Caddy, and on either side of him was Bernstein and Woodard. Those are the Watergate reporters, and Doug's role in that was probably more significant than most people realize. He showed up the next morning after the burglars had been arrested, asked by a friend to go down and look after their legal problems. Woodard and Bernstein noticed, what is this silk-stocking lawyer in this fashionable suit doing in this courtroom? And that whetted their appetite to see how deep this went. So that you know the term Watergate is probably the sole responsibility of my friend Doug Caddy. Doug Caddy, welcome to Public Affairs, Public Access again.
Well, thank you, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Doug and I have had these conversations for a while, and if you want to look them up, you can go online to the HMS Houston Media Source Facebook gathering, or not Facebook, but YouTube gathering. And in that archive, you'll find me and Doug having other conversations. Because today's conversation is a construction on the previous conversations.
That's right, but I would also mention that I've had interviews on darkjournalist.com and extensive interviews. And if people want more information about Watergate and the Kennedy assassination, they should go to darkjournalist.com for that.
Now, you were working for conservative organizations doing conservative things as you evolved into the situation in Watergate. Was that kind of an awakening for you?
It became an awakening, yes. But actually, I got involved in Watergate because I was working for General Foods Corporation after I was graduating from New York University Law School. And they sent me from their headquarters in White Plains, New York to Washington and said, for the first year, you're going to be our lobbyist, but for the first year, we want you to work out of the Robert Mullen Company, which was their public relations firm. And it was in the Kiplinger building in Washington, and this was 1969, and Howard Hunt came on board the staff. Richard Helms, the director of the CIA, placed Howard Hunt there in 1969, and we started talking, and it turned out that the godfather of Howard Hunt's children was William F. Buckley, and I'd written for National Review when I was at Georgetown undergraduate, and we founded Young Americans for Freedom at his family home in Sharon, Connecticut. And so Buckley was a very close friend of mine, so Howard Hunt and I hit it off, you might say.
Well, Howard Hunt was kind of a spook operation in that public relations firm?
Well, it turned out later on I did not know it because General Foods never told me, but Howard Baker, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but Howard Baker, in his own report to the Senate Watergate Committee that came out in 1974, disclosed that the Robert Mullen Company had been incorporated by the CIA in 1959. So here I was I was an employee of General Foods Corporation. I was their lobbyist, and here I was actually, unbeknownst to me, in the CIA front. And then this came out as part of the Watergate scandal. But I want to add something here about Woodward and Bernstein because, by the way, that picture was taken when Woodward and Bernstein spoke at the Wortham Center
here in Houston.
Here in Houston at the Brilliant Lecture Series 2 years ago. And Woodward actually, I think, he had more knowledge about my showing up at that arraignment than you mentioned. Let me put it this way, that in 1969 and 1970, Bob Woodward was the liaison from the Pentagon, from the Intelligence Committee from the Pentagon to the White House. He gave weekly briefings to General Alexander Haig, who was the chief of staff. And if you remember the big story in Vanity Fair about Deep Throat and Mark Felt, that's where Bob Woodward talks about meeting Mark Felt in the reception room while they're both waiting to meet different people, you know.
To debrief people in the White House.
Yeah, but it was really a two-way street. Because General Alexander Haig was a very ambitious man. He wanted to be Secretary of State. So not only did Woodward brief him, but General Alexander Haig sent information back that he wanted the Pentagon to know, you know.
Oh, okay, that's a two-way street.
But I thought before we get into, because we're going to talk today about was Watergate really about sex, and it was to a great extent. But I thought before we did that, I would just give how Watergate evolved, okay? And I'd start with the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. The day he was inaugurated in 1969, he signed National Security Decision Number 2, in which he took away the roles of the Pentagon, of the CIA, and the State Department in foreign policy development. And he said, from now on, it's going to be just me and just he and Henry Kissinger and the National Security Council. And you know how, so you can see how it was a sort of a diplomatic declaration of war against those three government agencies. And you can see how they felt being deprived of being active participants in the decision making. And this is one reason why Nixon was later forced to resign, because of the resentment that started the first day he took office, where he made this decision. That same year, in 1969, the Pentagon established a war room to monitor anti-war activities and the New Left. And as part of that, they assigned Carl Schaffler, who was an intelligence agent, to the Washington, D.C. police. He's going to figure in what I'm going to disclose today quite prominently. He was an intelligence agent, and he was assigned to the Washington, D.C. police. He brought with him $150,000 from the Pentagon to supplement the D.C. police budget to monitor anti-war activities and the New Left. And so also in 1970 was when Schaffler enrolled as his confidential informant. He was a police detective, Robert Merritt. And Robert Merritt in many ways is the cause of Watergate, as I'll explain, is the cause of Watergate, because he found out ahead of time of the plans of the burglars to burglarize the Watergate. He found that out from a drag queen. I'll get into that in a moment, from a drag queen and I'll explain the circumstances that took place. But also in 1970, which is when Detective Schaffler enrolled Robert Merritt as a confidential informant, there was a development inside the White House whereby the Pentagon, being unhappy with what Nixon had done, planted an agent in there to monitor what was going on in the White House. That agent was a yeoman named Charles Radford, and he worked with Henry Kissinger, and he reported to the chief of Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he later disclosed, when his role was uncovered, that he photographed over 1,000 documents in Henry Kissinger's briefcases.
Huh.
And when, like for example, when Kissinger was en route to China and was asleep on the plane, that's when Yeoman went in there and photographed all documents. And these were all given to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So they
okay, so you've got a president, you've got a secretary of state, yeah, and they have somehow opened their business office in the White House by separating themselves from the Department of the military Defense Department and the CIA and the intelligence agencies, and it's all a show that they're going to run without the participation of these other agencies.
That's correct.
But they're still getting briefed on what information these other agencies can come up with.
Oh, absolutely.
And at the same time, the agencies are stealing information to go back to their bosses. Yeah. And so I mean, this is a white spy, black spy thing on steroids.
Yeah. Well, what happened when it was discovered by the plumbers, actually, the plumbers in the White House, which was set up a little secret group to find out where the leaks were coming from, they found out it was Yeoman who was doing this process for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also giving information to Jack Anderson. Jack Anderson.
Oh yeah, Jack Anderson was the big journalist at the time and always a snooper.
Yeah, but he was a Mormon, and so was the Yeoman Radford, you know, and so. So Kissinger, Nixon and the Defense Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird had this conversation. It's a public record where they discuss what they're going to do about this. And they say, can we smear Jack Anderson and Yeoman Radford as being homosexuals? Because they may have a relationship. They discussed it, and then they said, no, we can't do that because both of them are married, they have children, there's no evidence they are, but it shows what the thinking was going on in those days.
Everybody's thinking about sex.
Yeah, everybody was thinking about sex. But jumping ahead, when it was published in Jack Anderson's columns about the Pentagon secret operation in the White House, this is part of Watergate, Hunt and Liddy met with a doctor from the CIA to discuss the killing of Jack Anderson. This is a major part of Watergate. This doctor who was on the staff of the CIA said these are the ways that assassinations can take place of Jack Anderson without there being any fingerprints on it and so forth, So, but that never did take place. That fell by the wayside as developments went on, but it showed the climate that was going on in those days, okay? But there was one other development that took place in 1970, and that was the development of the Houston Plan. Tom Houston was an assistant to Pat Buchanan, who was the speechwriter.
Okay. And
he was assigned by the highest level in the White House to develop the Houston Plan, which was the FBI and steroids. In other words, under the Houston Plan, they would do everything that the FBI could not do. They would do illegally. They would do burglaries, robberies. They would do assassinations. They would lock up people for no reason. They even had a plan to incarcerate anti-war activists in cells around the country. I mean, it was really a wild plan that they had.
Well, they didn't have to lock me up because I was an anti-war activist at the time, and I was already in prison by the time they got their act together.
Okay.
So I'm out of the range.
Uh-huh. Well, the accepted history is that J. Edgar Hoover opposed the Houston Plan. He said, no, the FBI can do everything properly, and we don't need this. William Sullivan, who was his assistant, actually worked against Hoover on this, though Hoover did not realize it. But the accepted history is that the Houston Plan never got off the ground. It was killed before it got in development. But actually, that is not true. It was going on right. It continued after the Watergate case broke.
Well, there's a certain amount of intrigue about any kind of sexual activity in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's the suspicion that everybody is involved in something that you can use to blackmail them and all that,
right,
of a sexual nature.
Right.
How did you miss all of that?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, you used to slip off and be gay from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I was a closeted gay, but I've never in my life ever been approached for blackmail or anything like that. But this does figure in the Watergate case because Carl Schroeffer, after recruited Robert Merritt, had a homosexual relationship with him. He moved into his apartment on P Street there the same day he enrolled Merritt as his informant. And for 2 years, even though he was married and had children, for 2 years they had a relationship, okay? And the way that Watergate case broke is like this. It broke this way. Robert Merritt used to go to DuPont Circle, which is where the
gay
people,
been there.
hippies and drug people and drug dealers.
Groovy place.
Yeah, real combination of people. And he used to go there, and one of his close friends was Rita Reed. Now, Rita Reed, they were both from West Virginia. Both of them came from broken homes. Both of them had been abused by priests. That's why Robert Merritt left West Virginia. He left 2 months before he was graduated from high school because he had been abused by priests in the church and in the school for several years. And what I've concluded by studying these people that have been abused by priests is they've really been shortchanged on life. Many of them are flawed individuals at no fault of their own. It's just they've had this horrendous experience, and they try to deal with it the best they can. That's why there's been so many lawsuits brought against the Catholic Church.
Well, using guilt as sexual lubrication is difficult to do, and the conflict between don't tell anybody and Jesus loves you, but you're a sinner, and you're committing a sin that's very difficult to get forgiven, and they use that as a control factor. It's a little wonder that these people are damaged immeasurably.
Yeah, I mean, this takes place while you're in junior high school, maybe even in younger high school and so forth. So Rita Reed's job was she was a switchboard operator at Columbia Plaza Apartments, which were located 2 blocks from Watergate. Now the Watergate burglars went into Watergate. The first burglary was on May 28, 1972. Okay, on May 31st, Rita Reed was doing the switchboard, and she got this call from the outside, asked her to connect on her switchboard to a hole in the switchboard there that had never been connected. And she said, well, that doesn't go anywhere. I've never connected that. Nobody actually knows where that goes. And the caller said, oh, well, I insist that you connect me to that. So she connected to that hole, and she decided, well, I'm going to listen in on this conversation, And this conversation was between 2 individuals in which they talked about going back into the Democratic National Committee on June 18th. This is on May 31st, 3 days after the first
initial
one, and they were very they talked about bringing down Nixon, and they talked about Crimson Rose. They kept talking about Crimson Rose, the phrase Crimson Rose, and this would be the end of Richard Nixon and so forth. And so the next day she went to Robert Merritt's apartment. Schaffler was not there at the time, and said, look, I have something to talk to you about, but I don't trust this apartment. I think this apartment is bugged, so we want to go outside. So they walked down to P Street, which is actually on part of Rock Creek Park, where people can lie out in the grass and get some sun. Then they walked down to the stream in Rock Creek Park there, which was about 2 blocks away. And they walked along, and they came out to, at the end of the stream there was the Watergate complex. And Rita Reed said, this is going to be the end of Nixon. She described this phone call that she had overheard to Robert Merritt, and said, they say this will be the end of Nixon. So Robert Merritt took this back to Schaffler and told Schaffler about what Rita Reed had told him. And Schaffler was a graduate of the NSA Vent Farm Station in Virginia, where they train people to monitor what's going on Embassy Row, primarily.
Okay. Sure.
And he was an expert on wiretapping, eavesdropping, and so forth. And so what he did was he set up a triangulation once he figured out who was involved and so forth, which he did very quickly. And so the wiretapper for the burglars, who was across the street, even though the wiretap was not working effective, they did get some things on that wiretap that they put in on May 28th, but it was not an effective one, totally effective. That's why they thought they had to go back in. Schaffler set up this triangulation so that the wiretapper, who was Alfred Baldwin, thought he was listening to a conversation in the Democratic National Committee, but was really Schaffler, the police detective, and one of his assistants having this conversation. And the conversation went like this: well, there's a very important envelope that's got to be picked up. It has these documents. We can't leave that too long at the committee there. It's going to be picked up at noon on Saturday. And so make sure that it's locked in that desk, okay? And so this was picked up by the wiretap burglar, eavesdropper, Alfred Baldwin, who was operating in the Howard Johnson hotel there, and reported back to the burglars. And so they had planned to go in on June 18th. And so what in the conversation that was overheard that Schaffler had set up, they said the envelope was going to be picked up at noon on June 17th, Saturday, instead of June 18th, which was Sunday. So the burglars moved it from the 18th to the 17th. They went in right after midnight on
the 17th.
On the 17th. Now, why did they do that? They did that because Carl Schaffler's birthday was June 17th. And the arrest of the burglars, which he knew ahead of time, was going to be his birthday present.
No.
He was parked just a block away, awaiting even though he was supposed to go off duty, he was supposed to go off duty at the police department at 6 p.m. He asked to work overtime. He was supposed to go to Pennsylvania to have his birthday party with his family there. And he was parked just a block away, waiting for that phone call to come in that the guard there, who was part of Schaffler's team, so to speak, that he knew that the burglar
would discover the door.
Yeah, the door.
As if it was a surprise.
Yeah, And so that's how the arrest went down, okay, and with the prior knowledge of Schaffler. And Schaffler claims in these interviews, which you can watch on the 20th anniversary of Watergate is on C-SPAN, and Schaffler is interviewed on there, and he talks about finding a key on one of the burglars, Well, the key was planted there. It was a key that he had made ahead of
For
time.
that desk drawer?
Was well, it leads to the desk drawer, okay, but it was a false lead, okay. There was really no envelope in the desk drawer. It was all made up. See?
All that was made up.
All made up. See? But the burglars thought there was an envelope. See?
Okay, so all of that. Oh, this is more black spy, white spy trickery than I ever imagined.
Yeah, well, and so he claimed that he got this key, a key off the burglar, okay, Martinez, okay. He said he was trying to swallow it. Actually, it was taped to a little notebook. It was actually one of the detective's notebooks. What it was, it just had a diagram in there of the Democratic National Committee floor plan, okay. But he went back to his precinct and said, "Look, I found this key," and so his sergeant said, "My God, who knows? They may have bombs. Who knows how big this thing is? You know?" He said, "We're going to get search warrants," and so they got all sorts of search warrants for all sorts of things. They made a big deal out of it, and it was really a key that had been made by Schaffler. The other key, actually, to the desk was taped underneath a drinking cup on the desk of the secretary, and so in the midst of the arrest, he got that key off of that, so that he could later on go back with the FBI agents a week later and open that desk, and of course there was nothing in there, you know. But so Schaffler, right after the arrests were made, called the Washington Post and told them what had gone down, and guess who was assigned to the case by the Washington Post was Bob Woodward, and so you had an intelligence agent, Carl Schaffler, calling the Washington Post, and of all people, Bob Woodward was assigned another intelligence.
Who was basically a young reporter. He'd had some background, but he was a young man then.
But he was intelligent. He was an intelligence agent. I mean, he had gone from the intelligence.
Well, he would understand what the story was about.
Yes.
Now,
but
how far?
Merritt maintains that Schaffler told him that he had told Woodward to be at his desk, not telling him the reason. He just said, "Be at your desk at 6 a.m. in the morning." That's what Schaffler. Merritt, that's what Schaffler told Merritt. He had told Woodward ahead of time. Okay.
Okay. Now Merritt wound up being the person Bernstein identified, or Woodward identified as Deep Throat.
No, Deep Throat was Mark Felt, an assistant director of the FBI. Okay.
Assistant director of the FBI.
Okay.
Well, what was Mark's role?
Mark Felt's role?
Yeah.
Well, he was just assistant director of the FBI. He wanted to be. J. Edgar Hoover died 2 weeks before the first break-in.
Yeah.
Robert Merritt and I believe he did not die a natural death. That sounds strong, but.
No, but it couldn't have lasted too much longer. His health was bad.
Yeah, but the timing was very suspicious.
Yeah.
Okay. And I heard John Judge, who was a very.
They sealed his place and went in and got all the records.
Yeah. And so with the death of J. Edgar Hoover, there was a real question who's going to be the next director, and Mark felt he should be the next director. And when he was not named the next director, he started leaking things to the Washington Post. But the real Deep Throat was Carl Schaffler.
Yeah.
He had
clearly, because he knew everything.
He had everybody wiretapped and eavesdropping. All during Watergate, he knew exactly what was going on. He kept feeding the Washington Post what the information that on the whole story. Okay.
And he was a cop.
He was a cop. Now, right after Watergate broke, and the Washington Post profiled me because I was at the arraignment and so forth. This is part of the movie All the President's Men and so forth. Schaffler came to Merritt and said, "Look, we want you to get close to this fellow Caddy because he's gay and you're gay, and we want you to find out what makes Caddy tick." Okay, and Schaffler said, Merritt said, "Well, look, we don't follow. We're not in the same world, so to speak. I mean, how is he going to meet me? You know, and it'd be very difficult to meet me." Even though I lived right across the street, I lived in the Georgetown house, and he lived in Hartnett Hall, which is right across the street. Yeah. But and so there was a period of frustration there. But and then I was walking my dog. I had a little dog at that time. My sister gave me a little dog, and this is like a week after Watergate broke. And I went out the back entrance of the Georgetown house where I lived to the Fairfax Hotel. It had a big grassy area to walk my dog, and this car came roaring up. and they stopped, came roaring up to the parking lot and stopped 6 feet away from me. And there was Carl Schauffer. I recognized him because I had gone to the precinct where the burglars were being held before the arraignment, and he came up and asked me a question whether I knew any of the burglars, you know.
Yeah, they were feeling you out for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And so I recognized he was saying something. He was talking, and it looked like he wanted me to come over and the window was open to hear what he had to say. But I was so startled by this whole thing because the car just almost came so close to running me over. I grabbed my little dog and went in the Georgeton house. But I have since learned that had I gone to the window there, I would have been killed. Schauffer wanted me killed. And Robert Merritt was in the back seat, and they were going to put a bullet right between my eyes. Okay. So that did not take place. But the fallback was they were going. The police and the FBI both came to Merritt and said, "Look, we want you to do this with Caddy." Okay. They said we can get you to know Caddy. I don't know how they're going to do that. I don't think they ever could. But if you'll have a sexual relationship with him, we'll arrange where you can poison him. And that will be the end of Caddy, okay? And that was a serious discussion. By the way, this is discussed in the special prosecutor's papers, what they were trying to do to me and how Schauffer wanted this done. Now, the question of why...
And your only involvement was responding to a friend's call to go down and help somebody he knew.
Okay, but why did they want to... Well, several reasons. One, Schauffer was a closeted gay. He was a self-hating gay. He was very upset that a closeted gay was representing the burglars and Hunt and Liddy and so forth. But more important than that, and the real reason they wanted me done in, it was really the intelligence community that wanted me done in, was that they knew I had a long-term friendship with Howard Hunt and his wife Dorothy. They were my closest friends in Washington. I had had lunch and dinner with them many, many times and many conversations and so forth. They didn't know what I knew. In other words, Howard Hunt, as we now know, was a key figure in the Kennedy assassination, right?
Yeah.
Howard Hunt was a key figure in the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
Howard Hunt knew about what he later told me, the alien presence, which is the belief that there is an alien presence in the world.
And Howard Hunt was in a position to actually have that kind of information.
Yes, because he was a protege of the Dulles brothers. He wrote the book. He came from the OSS into the CIA, and he was a protege of the Dulles brothers. And he wrote The Craft of Intelligence. He ghost wrote that book, Allen Dulles' book. It was really. I've narrowed it down to the Office of Naval Intelligence. They thought, here's this case. Here's this guy Caddy. We don't know anything about him. He can somehow disclose what happened in the Kennedy assassination. In other words, the real story of the Kennedy assassination.
They would have known
because Howard
behind the scenes information.
Howard Hunt may have told me that, and what happens in the Bay of Pigs and all these vital secrets. In other words, and said the quickest thing is just to terminate this guy early on. Okay, and that was the reason why they wanted to get rid of me. I didn't know these things. I did not know these things. Howard Hunt was very circumspect in what he told me.
Sure, Howard Hunt's kind of got to play his cards real close to his chest.
Yeah, well, he was a trusted.
Because he knew everything.
He knew everything, but he was a CIA agent. I mean, he knew you just don't talk.
Now, what books were ghost-written you were just talking about?
Ghostwritten.
You were talking. We got into Howard Hunt and the Dulles brothers.
Well, Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was fired by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. Because it was such a debacle.
Yeah.
Okay.
He had no good information, and it blew up in his face. It was an international embarrassment.
They misled him, and so Allen Dulles was forced to resign from the CIA. But what he did was he still remained active, and he wrote a book, The Craft of Intelligence, was really written by Howard Hunt. But while we're in the Bay of Pigs, let me just mention one other thing, okay? Because a close friend of mine is James Rothstein, who's a retired New York City detective, and he was on the ship Essex, which was one of the ships involved in the Bay of Pigs. That's where the planes took off and bombed, okay? But when the ship was at Newport News before it departed, they didn't know what the sailors on board didn't know where they were going. Okay.
Sure.
It departed. This boat came alongside, and two big cylinders were loaded on the Essex. Two huge cylinders. I would say twice the way Rothschild Detective Rothblatt Rothstein describes it as twice the size of this table. These were atomic bombs. Right. These were atomic bombs that were put on board that. It's never been disclosed. Nobody has talked about the ship Essex for 50 years. Only about 3 years ago were the first indication that such a ship existed. Everybody on board was sworn to secrecy. They never could talk about what had happened on that ship and so forth.
And it became nuclear powered for the Bay of Pigs invasion?
For the Bay of Pigs. And Rothstein was at the helm when the call came from Kennedy to the ship captain and said, the bombing is now must be stopped. The whole invasion must be called off.
Crazy.
Okay? I don't know this for a fact, but what I think JFK had learned as this crisis developed was that the military had gone around him and put these bombs on board, and had they ever been used, Rothstein said it was shipped. It would have taken Cuba to the island of Cuba to the bottom of the sea. Okay.
Good Lord.
This would have started World War III, and so JFK finally realized what he was up against. He was up against. He couldn't trust the military. He couldn't trust the CIA, and that led to the animus eventually later on of why they killed him. Basically, they were the motivating force.
And you've written a couple of books about some of these experiences.
Yes. The primary one is called Watergate Exposed. You can get that on Amazon. It's Robert Merritt's. Robert Merritt tells his story to me,
and
I
make a book out of it.
And I write it up and also put my story in there at the same time.
Is it who's published?
Trine Day publishes this.
Trine Day.
But I've had 6 books published, actually. 3 of them were published by Texas A&M University Press. So I'm an attorney, but I'm also an author. But it was decided, the reason the assassination attempts were called off against me was I was subpoenaed. I was in the federal courthouse on June 28th, just a week after Watergate broke, and I was handed a subpoena to appear forthwith before the grand jury. My arm was grabbed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Donald Campbell, and I was pulled into the grand jury room. And I became a very controversial character. For the first month, if you read the Washington Post, it's all about me, basically, because I refused to answer 38 questions and so forth. But I became...
Can you refuse to answer a question?
Because of the attorney-client privilege.
Sure.
That was my client's...
It's an ethical issue.
Yeah, ethical issue, you know. Yeah, and so I became too hot. In other words, too hot to be assassinated at that point. So, but they decided.
Congratulations.
Yeah, Yeah, well, I was saved by being subpoenaed before a grand jury. Who believe that's the way to be saved? But in 1973, a year later, they decided, well, we're not through with Caddy yet, okay? And so what they did was, this is. I'm going to hold up this right here. This is where Robert Merritt went public in October of 1973 with everything he knew about what he'd been doing for the FBI, and they've been doing incredible things. They've been poisoning the anti-war demonstrators, cutting the lines to their loudspeakers, grabbing their petitions that had been signed so they could know who had signed them, you know, planting drugs on them. It was unbelievable what they did to the anti-war.
Oh yeah, well, my good friends over at the Socialist Workers Party were so heavily infiltrated that they couldn't make quorum at any meeting without the presence of some undercover agents.
Right. And so as part of this, he talks about Watergate and me in there, okay, and he outs me, you might say, and he goes on TV at the same time. And then in 1977, he gives a 2-part interview to the Advocate, which was a gay newspaper.
Yeah.
And what she talks about all the illegal activities that he had done for the FBI and for military intelligence and for the Washington D.C. police, and in there once again brings up what happened in Watergate and my role and so forth. So that's how they. This is it.
But you actually weren't a co-conspirator with him. You were just somebody else that he talked about in these articles.
Oh yeah, I actually have never met Robert Merritt.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never met him, even to this day. You know, we worked together on the book, but from long distance. You know.
Yeah.
No, the end result of Watergate was I was never indicted or listed as an unindicted co-conspirator or as a defendant in the Democratic civil suit. I was completely exonerated. My role was completely, even though Sirica was very vicious towards me, as were the prosecutors, I was thoroughly investigated, and they realized I just answered a phone call in the middle of the night from a client of the law firm who was Howard Hunt.
Yeah.
He came to my apartment and retained me and my law firm, Gaulding, Powell and Kilcullen, to represent him and Liddy and the burglars in Watergate.
Earlier on, you mentioned a drag queen having a role in it. Tell me about that.
Well, the drag queen was the one who got that listened in that phone call.
Oh, the drag queen was the switchboard operator.
Switchboard operator.
All right.
And she disappeared the day after she told the story to Robert Merritt. He maintains she was killed. She's never been seen since.
And there's no obituary appeared in the paper?
No, just disappeared off the face of the earth. Most likely, because Merritt was threatened at one time too. They said, we'll put concrete shoes on you and toss you in Potomac. And that's most likely what happened to Rita Reed. You know, people like that who come from broken homes and have these terrible things that happen.
If you don't have anybody that's concerned about you, if you go missing, who asks the question?
Yeah, you're just gone. Okay, and so I've given somewhat of the gay sex angle, but let's go about the straight sex angle in Watergate. Okay.
Okay.
The straight sex angle is that both John Dean and Jeb Magruder. Jeb Magruder was the number 2 guy in the committee for the re-election of the president. Okay?
Sure. Creep.
Okay. What happened was on June 6, 1972, this article appeared in the Washington Evening Star, Capitol Hill Girl Ring Uncovered. Okay, and it was being run by the mafia. They had a lawyer who was the front man on it. And so John Dean immediately was concerned because his girlfriend was Maureen Biner, who was living with the mistress of the call girl ring being operated out of the Democratic National Committee. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. And so he called the assistant U.S. attorney and said, I'd like to see the book that you got of the clients you got from that lawyer that you've arrested for that prostitution ring. Can you bring that to the White House? So the assistant U.S. attorney brought it to the White House, and John Dean was going through the book, looking at all these names, prominent names, both parties, of course, you know.
Yeah, of course.
And he said, I want to keep this. And the assistant, no, this is part of a criminal case. He said, can I make copies of this? So they allowed him to make copies of this. So this is all part of the public record. Okay. But then they knew that the prostitution ring was being operated out of the Democratic National Committee. That was one purpose for having the wiretap going in there originally. And so the question in the minds of John Dean and Jeb Magruder was, what names are in the book of the prostitution ring in the Democratic National Committee? They have the book from Capitol Hill, but they don't have the book from the Democratic National Committee. And so that was one of the reasons. There were several reasons for going back in on June 28th, which was June 18th, which was moved to June 17th. Going back in the second time, there were several reasons for going back in, but one of them was to get photographs of the books, of the photograph copies of the book that had the clients in there. What happened was that because Schaffner knew that the burglaries were going to take place, the burglars were inside. He arrested them before they could do anything. They had their equipment set up to do all this, but he arrested them. So that never happened, okay? But there was that great worry. Now the mafia was running these prostitution rings. And John Dean was dating and later married Maureen, who was the roommate of Heidi Reichen, who ran the prostitution ring. Mm-hmm. And so John Dean was worried when the Watergate broke, where would this go? How this would lead back to him? How would this lead back to him? And so he was in charge of the cover-up of Watergate. Nixon, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman said, well, John Dean's our counsel. He says that he can handle all this. They just sort of relegated this whole thing to John Dean. And so John Dean ran the cover-up. But running the cover-up was really to protect John Dean, not to protect Nixon. In other words, he didn't want it disclosed that he had asked him to go back in the second time, and he didn't want to disclose that he had this relationship that ultimately led to a prostitution ring being run by the mafia. And I have to add also here that early on in Watergate, over the 4th of July, I was approached with the hush money, and I turned it down. This is part of the public record.
Yeah, you've told me that story 2 or 3 times. When you met with the Watergate burglars, who, for all reasons and purpose, are your clients.
Yeah.
And somebody said, well, what do they want? And
No.
you asked that question, and they started talking about hush money and other things, and you backed off.
No. Actually, what happened here was I got the call out of the blue from a fellow who gave me a false name, obviously, and said that he wanted me to pass the hush money to the burglars, okay? It was John Dean who had selected me because to select me, given the name to the fellow to call me, okay? It was John Dean. John Dean was hopeful that I would accept that hush money and pass it on to the defendants, and of course I refused. It was done in such a way that I talked about it to the managing partner of my law firm, and he said, we don't know anything about this fellow who's calling you. This could be a false lead, this could be a setup. But on the other hand, it could actually be the White House, it could be it could be the real thing. And said, once you accept that money, you're under the control of these people. They have something they can dictate to you, And so you're no longer a free agent once you accept the money the hush money. And so when the fellow who his name was Rivers is the name he gave me, called back on about the 4th of July, I had a partner of the law firm, Bob Scott, sitting in my office as a witness that I had turned him down. I turned down the guy on the phone, and when I turned him down, he sort of swallowed. He sort of went, oh, he sort of almost, he was gasping. He was so shocked that I had turned him down, basically, And strange enough, the lawyer who succeeded me in representing Hunt, because I had to bow out once I was a witness before the grand jury.
Sure.
I know this is very complicated, but
No, it's not very complicated because you had an ethical obligation to get off the scene.
Yeah, and so the lawyer who was a partner of a major law firm in Washington accepted the money that I turned down. And the way he arranged it was with the hush money was to be deposited in the telephone book in the phone booth, in those days they had payphones. So
I remember payphones and phone booths with telephone books in them.
Yeah, and so
none of those things exist anymore.
No. So the money was left it was in the lobby of his building. That's how he got the money. Okay, so he was later named an unindicted co-conspirator. Okay, and so now the lawyer who managed the prostitution ring from Capitol Hill, he immediately was committed to St. Elizabeth's. Okay?
Oh, okay.
That's how they got rid of him. He knew too much, okay? He was not insane at all. He was not crazy, but
he went to St. Elizabeth's, which could have been his getting out from being a target. It could be somebody's disposing of it.
Yeah. So he had too much knowledge, okay? And so that's a straight sex angle. There was a pornography shop operated by the mafia there. Joseph Nesline was the chief mafia guy. Underneath him was Buster Regan, who ran the pornography shop. And Buster Regan had a big mansion on 16th Street, and he used to have monthly orgies there. Prominent people from Washington would come, knowing that nobody would squeal on each other, basically.
Yeah.
We have 2 to 3 dozen people there.
It's like Baptist deacons at the bookstore.
Yeah, but actually it was the mafia running this, and they were videotaping it, and they had all these people compromised. Once you have people doing stuff, you control them. And that's the bottom line of public life, is it's an attempt to get something on the other individual.
And it never goes away. I mean, look at former Speaker of the House Hassert right now.
Exactly.
We're talking about 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
And it never washes off.
It never washes off. It's going on today. And the CIA sets up these operations. They had the detective I talked about, James Rothstein, uncovered 3 safe houses in New York City that were used when he was a detective for this very purpose, to lure targets there, to have straight or gay sex, and videotape them and have them blackmailed. They had a famous U.S. senator, they had admirals, they had a Secretary of Defense. I mean, they had all sorts of people, okay? And this is what goes on. Recently, it was disclosed they had a house in San Francisco that dispensed LSD, and it was a way to track how people would react taking LSD. Okay.
Yeah, well, of course, that they were experimenting. In my youth, that was college campus stuff.
Yeah.
You could sign up for a program, or you could wait until the school bus got there.
Right. So the message I want people to take away today, and by the way, here's an article about John Dean from the Washington Post of all things, because it says, John Dean's sex machine and other revelations from the new Nixon tapes, okay? And here,
Well, everything was on those tapes.
yeah. But here is Nixon and Haldeman talking about John Dean, and this comes from the Oval Office tapes, and Haldeman says, I think he takes all of his frustrations out on pure, raw, animal, unadulterated sex, Haldeman says. Nixon, is that right? Is he quite a, looks like stud, okay? And Haldeman talking to the president, I guess he solves all his hang-ups that way, okay?
Mercy.
And so John Dean was a sex machine. I mean, that's as the Washington Post headline says, you know. And so the purpose of this, what we're talking about today is an untold chapter of Watergate. Was Watergate really about sex? To a great extent, it really was about sex. It was about John Dean and Jeb Magruder trying to find out whether the name was in that book inside the Democratic National Committee. You know, it was about.
And it began as an effort to possibly bring Nixon down.
Yeah.
But that happened. It wasn't on that plan that it happened, but it happened.
What happened was the plan to go into the Democratic National Committee evolved over a period of months, about 3 or 4 months. And actually, the fellow who called me, Anthony Ulasewicz, about the hush money, went into the Democratic National Committee 2 months before the burglary took place as a visitor, and looked around and came back to the White House and said, there's nothing there of value. There's no reason to go in there. Please call off this whole thing. You know, he was ignored. Okay, he was ignored. But that's at that point the thing started gelling, and that's when those who realized what was going to take place realized this was their opportunity to bring Nixon down. Okay, and that's what they did. And there's one other aspect here too. We know that from the Admiral Moore and Yeoman Radford operation inside the White House, where they were photographing Kissinger's documents and so forth. There was a military operation that did not cease when that was exposed. It continued on in the White House. The CIA had its operation in the White House through Howard Hunt. Both agencies had their spies in the Nixon White House. Howard Hunt was a close friend of Richard Helms. Helms was the director of the CIA. He's the one who placed Hunt in the Mullen Company. And so what the CIA did, it developed a report on the military operations inside the White House. That's what the CIA does. It collects information.
Yeah.
That's what it does. Howard Hunt told me, he said, they
vacuum it up.
They vacuum it up. It may not be worth anything, but something in there may be worthwhile, okay? And so they developed a report, okay? The title of the report, I have to read it here. It's called Crimson Rose. Confidential Report on Intelligence of Military Secret Operations on Nixon. The subtitle, Report of Operations of Secret Surveillance and Eavesdropping. It was a 400-page report developed by the CIA for its internal purposes of the military operation inside the White House that brought Nixon down.
Well, when you look at that, bringing Nixon down and all of these organizations, it must be held to be Barack Obama.
Well, he's smart enough to have kept. There's been no scandal. No scandal, and he's kept he kept it close to his vest. In that sense, you have to admire how President Obama.
How he just survived.
How he survived.
I mean, to complete your term.
Yeah.
Without some kind of dark shadow over your life is an amazing accomplishment.
Amazing accomplishment. Now, what happened to the Crimson Rose report? This was one that was developed.
The Crimson Rose brings to mind the imagery of V for Vengeance, the funny movie about the undercover thing, because Crimson Rose plays an important part of that. What is Crimson Rose?
Okay. maybe a different Crimson Rose, okay?
V for Vendetta, yeah. It's
okay.
maybe a different one, but.
But what happened was Mitchell McGovern was with Arnold and Porter, and when the general counsel of the CIA retired, his name was Houston, was his name.
Yeah.
Retired. He became general counsel of the CIA. This is Mitchell McGovern. He was also Robert Merritt's personal attorney, and they knew each other through the Institute of Policy Studies, okay, which was a target of the FBI in the Houston plan and so forth and so on, okay? And so what happened was Shafter devised this plan, military intelligence devised this plan. In 1975 and 76, there were hearings by the Church Committee and by Senator Congressman Otto Pike of Long Island into the CIA and so forth. And so the military, the Pentagon was afraid that this report inside the CIA on the military operation, the Crimson Report, how Nixon was brought down, would somehow Senator Church and his committee would get hold of this report, or Otto Pike. That would blow up the whole thing. That would really rewrite history, okay? And so they lured Mitchell McGovern to the Mayflower Hotel. A friend lured him there to dinner. His drink was spiked, and he was sort of hand-carried, helped this poor drunk out, to a freight elevator. He was taken upstairs, and he was photographed. Buster Regan, I mentioned earlier, who was a part of ran the prostitution ring, but with a prostitute, in bed, okay, he was photographed in compromise. And when he woke up, they presented him with the photographs and said, we're just asking you for one thing. We want you to go back into the CIA and get the copy out of the Crimson Rose, the CIA's copy of the Crimson Rose. There is a room in the CIA where all these real vital
Secrets are kept.
They're all
kind of like J. Edgar Hoover's house.
But they're chained, okay? It's like it's chained, and you can read them there, but you can't take them out. But he knew that he had to do that, and so he brought the report out with the chain, okay? And the arrangement was he was to give it to Merritt, and Merritt was to give it to Shafter, who would take it to the Pentagon. But what Mitchell McGovern did, unbeknownst to the military, was he gave 4 copies to Merritt. And he said, you take the one with the chain, which has a binder on it, back to Shafter, and Shafter will take it to the Pentagon. The other 4 copies here, I want you to take these to these organizations. And 4 copies of the 400-page report were taken to 4 organizations in Washington, okay? And I think they exist today, okay? I think they exist today. And so that's how Mitchell McGovern got even with what they did to him. Okay, I'll give you the copy from inside, but he arranged for 4 copies to be deep 6, you might say, out there. They're sitting out there. Eventually one may surface. Hopefully one may surface, okay? And so that's the story of Crimson Rose. In other words, Watergate, the full story of Watergate may yet be told about how Nixon was brought down.
Well, things are never as simple as the first writing of its history is. We're still finding things out about Abraham Lincoln and about the Anderson, the people of that era. Doug Caddy, I appreciate your coming on to Public Affairs, Public Access. And I want to talk to the folks in that camera for a few minutes. This is Public Affairs, Public Access. I'm Ray Hill, and who you've been listening to for the last hour is Doug Caddy. I've kind of stayed out of his way because he comes in here packed with so much information that I can't possibly get it all out with questions and answers, but he can tell you it. And here's a man who is recognized by who's who in American law, who's who in America, and who's who in the world. We're talking about incidents that happened 45 plus years ago, in which he was at times a bystander, at times deeply involved, and sometimes being deeply involved and not even aware of how deeply involved he really was. But he made memory notes of that, and he can share it with us today. That's one of the purposes of Houston Media Source. We find stories that you're not going to find on any other television in Houston, and we have the freedom here to tell them. May make you a little uncomfortable, certainly makes government officials and other things uncomfortable, but we don't care. I am allowed to come into this seat because I do an occasional host job on public access, public affairs. And when I do that, nobody tells me what I can do and nobody tells me what I can't do, because Houston Media Source itself is content neutral. That represents an enormous idea of freedom that you do not enjoy in other media. Other media have got to go check the story out, make it sure it's double sourced and somebody else saw it. We don't care. We bring you information and let you sort it out. That's who we are. We're also the avenue whereby you too can do media. You can go to our website, www.hmstv.org, and we have a whole bunch of information of how you can use our equipment, this very studio, and make media that you think needs to be done but nobody else is doing it. So you can sit there for the rest of your life with your fists clenched, your beer in one hand, and cursing your television screen because it is not telling you what you want to hear. Well, guess what? You can get on television and tell them what you think they need to hear all by yourself. And the way you do that is www.hmstv.org. And if television's too complicated for you, I'm in here every Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock to do hmsnetradio.org broadcast on our internet radio station. You can do it in radio, you can do it in television, or you can get you a pencil and paper and just wonder where the notes fly. My name is Ray Hill. My guest tonight has been Douglas Caddy. If you Google either one of us, you're going to be shocked at how much is actually there. And Doug, it's always fun.
Well, thank you, Ray. I appreciate being invited and disclosing the information I have. Thank you.
That's wonderful. And theme music is going to start in a minute. In the meantime, I want to thank you for listening. And you can tell your friends that this is available on the Houston Media Source YouTube page. All you got to do is index, and all of the programs that I've done here and some I've done in the other studio will be available there. And thank you very much. From Houston Media Source, my name is Ray Hill, and have a wonderful, wonderful week.